Welcome, everyone. Hello. Welcome, everyone. Okay. It is my honor to introduce Shirley Moody-Turner today. It is also an honor to have the distinguished Mary Helen Washington with us. Welcome, Professor Washington. Shirley Moody-Turner is Associate Professor of English and African American Studies at Penn State University, where she has been engaging in award-winning scholarship and teaching for a few years. She is the author of Black Folklore and the Politics of Racial Representation, published by the University Press of Mississippi in its acclaimed folklore series. This book explores the role of African American folklore in the fight against Jim Crow and argues that Black creative writers not only use folklore in their work, but also actually were theorists of African American folklore. This first book by Professor Moody-Turner also established Anna Julia Cooper as an important intellectual and theorist of Black folklore studies at the turn of the last century. And shortly after the publication of Black Folklore, Shirley Moody-Turner was recognized as a leading scholar of Black folklore studies and, of course, of not only Anna Julia Cooper, but also Black print culture. Her other work includes the books Contemporary African American Literature, The Living Canon, co-edited with Loverly King, African American Literature in Transition, 1900-1910, and most recently, the Penguin Portable Anna Julia Cooper. In addition to being an amazingly productive scholar, Shirley Moody-Turner is a brilliant builder of community and of innovative programming in teaching, education, and the digital humanities. Indeed, she is founding co-editor of the Center for Black Digital Research and founding director of the Black Women's Organizing Archive, a student-led project that works across institutions to bring together the scattered archives of Black women's organizing across the long 19th century. In 2021, she was part of an interdisciplinary team of faculty and administrators awarded a $3.1 million grant from the Mellon Foundation to support transformative change in higher education through fellowships for innovative scholarship, digital training opportunities, and pipeline building, work she has been committed to since 2016 when she founded the Cooper Du Bois mentoring program to build pipelines to the PhD for historically underrepresented students. As a fellow here at the Hutchins Center, she has been at work on the first interpretive biography of Cooper for Yale University's Press's Black Lives series, reframing Cooper's courageous revolt as part of the long history of Black women's organizing and activism. Please welcome Shirley Moody-Turner.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. It's always wonderful to hear Krishna give your introduction. You're like, wow, okay. And thank you everyone for coming out and for being here today. Thank you for doing a picture and doing it again. That helped break the ice a little bit. And I wanted to also just give some acknowledgments today. As we all know, nobody does it alone, and there's always, one person standing here, but so many people who make that work possible. And I really want to give a special thank you to the Hutchins Center, to Skip, to Krishna, to Abby, to Velma, to Justin. I shouldn't start naming names because I don't think I can name everybody, but to everyone at the Hutchins Center for creating such a warm and welcoming space for us to do this work and do it in community. Being here has given me time to sit with Anna Julia Cooper and to sit with my project in ways that would not have been possible otherwise, so thank you. And to my fellows, I've only been here since the spring, but I have enjoyed so much getting to know you all, and especially the presentation. Some of you see my working mom notebook that my daughter gave me to bring with me and take notes while I'm here. And I just have, at every presentation, I'm taking notes about everybody's work and all of the connections and questions that they're prompting, so thank you. And to my writing group who came here from different parts of the country today, Mary Helen Washington, Sean Myers, and Catherine Bell. They have made this biography a collaborative work in the truest sense of the word. It really is a collaboration, and I'm so grateful to have such wonderful, generous, and brilliant people to work with. And my family, who came all from Western New York and Central New York, but that's a hike nonetheless. So thank you so much for.
Introduce your mother.
My mom is in the back. Hi, Mom. Mom is here, and my sisters Sharon and Karen. That's our trio. So our trio is here now.
Like church. We have visitors.
So thank you all so much. It's nice to be loved, so thank you. And also I want to say a big thank you to my research assistants at Penn State who really keep me honest. I come up with theories and they prove them wrong. I'm like, I think it's this, and they pull the stuff and like, nope, what's this? So Katie Warzak and Kevin Cedeno Pacheco, thank you. And finally, I want to give a quick shout out to my team at the Black Women's Organizing Archive. They have been working really hard while I'm here to bring together, and this is actually, I think it might have gone to sleep, but they've been working really hard to bring together a project that we've been working on for a long time, and we are launching just this week 2 directories of papers for Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Mary Church Terrell. So they've identified digital and print collections across the country and brought those together, and they are now available on our BWA website.
That's great. Are we fixing the computer, guys?
Oh, is that it?
Do that right now.
Okay.
Okay, that's there. She's up.
Did we get unplugged anywhere?
It wasn't showing us.
We're up? Okay. All these pictures, we, the PowerPoint was taking a break. But it's back, and that's our archive that we're launching this week, so really excited to be able to launch that and excited for the team. And we'll be having a digitized Black Women's Records Day in March 2024, so more information about that to follow. So I wanted to give a talk today that is about the biographical methods and the approach that have gone into this work. So the talk's going to kind of proceed in 3 parts. One is to share a little bit about my biographical method, the approach that I've taken to do this project, and then to give an overview of Anna Julia Cooper. Who was she? Most people in this room know who she was. Some people may not. But to just kind of to give an overview of who she was in her life. And then in the third part, I kind of share about what I see as the foundations for chapter 1. So we're really in the beginning of the beginning, just the first part of chapter 1, but trying to think about how her early life and experiences, and particularly her family relations, shaped her later work in activism. Okay. Found among Anna Julia Cooper's papers at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University is a booklet simply titled Grapes from Thorns, The First Step, dated 1956, when Cooper would have been 97 years old. With faded brown cover and grid-lined pages, the booklet lived its first life as a roll book for Frelinghuysen University, a group of community schools for which Cooper was serving as registrar at the time of the book's dating. Repurposed for what appears to be the beginnings of an autobiographical narrative crafted from a vantage point late in life, Grapes from Thorns contains 3 poems and 1 autobiographical fragment. In what she titles, In the Beginnings, Authoritative Forecasts, Cooper starts by recounting the story of Jacob Stanley, her maternal grandfather, as related through oral history and family lore. She notes that Jacob Stanley was a broad-chested, upstanding Black man who took part in the planning and construction of the state capitol building in Raleigh, North Carolina, and that Dr. Fabius Haywood was his owner. pointing to the exploitation and uncompensated labor that helped build the Haywood family wealth and quite literally the state capital of Raleigh, Cooper writes, "So notable was Jacob Stanley's contributions to the public exchequer that expert economists volunteered friendly advice to Haywood, to which Haywood, you should make that end support you and your whole family, just his production alone. To which Haywood responded, as Cooper tells us, with characteristic drawl and aristocratic profanity, if Jacob supports me, who the hell's gonna support Jacob and his brats? Damn if I am." Cooper positions this short retelling of Jacob Stanley's critical role in building the Haywood family wealth and the easy dismissal of his labor as the opening anecdote in an imagined autobiographical narrative, which she would never complete. Instead, when she took up her pen to write her family history, she would offer authoritative beginnings, but end with the blank pages and haunting silences that stretched out before her as she sought to construct her family's past. In my brief comments today, I start with reference to this small, unassuming archival document as a metonym for my larger biographical method and practice. Like most biographers, I turn to archives of letters, speeches, published and unpublished writings, newspaper articles, census records, surveys, and if they are available, interviews with family members, diaries, journals, and other private writings. But with Cooper, I found a particular problem, the problem of what I call the public-facing archive. Perhaps as a result of the public spectacle to which she was subjected in 1905, when the DC School Board set to remove her from her position as principal of the famed M Street High School, replete with charges of sexual misconduct and allegations of administrative incompetence, Cooper may have, as Vivian may suggest, come to guard her private life from public scrutiny. In Cooper's archive, there are no journals, no diaries, no living family members to talk to who knew her. Even her personal letters and correspondences often maintain a level of informality that conceal and control access to her private life. The majority of Cooper's archive is public-facing. Drafts of essays, public speeches, published and unpublished essays, letters, mostly professional or taking up other social or political issues of the day, newspaper articles, and even the autobiographical works that she composed are carefully shaped to present the key moments in her life and educational journey. There are precious few places, usually in fragments of writing, informal notes, surveys and questionnaires, or on scraps of paper, where we gain insight into how Cooper might have experienced her day-to-day life. So one of the challenges I faced in writing this biography is how to move beyond formalized narratives and how to answer the questions I was most interested in exploring. How did she experience, understand, and shape her role as part of the vanguard of Black women's activism, charting a path to higher education and crafting a life as a Black public intellectual when in many ways that path had yet to be forged? And even more specifically for my comments today, how might her early experiences in family history have shaped the prophetic voice and radical vision we encounter in her work? Over the years, the work of Kevin Young, Sadia Hartman, Elizabeth Alexander, and others has been critical to my thinking about how we construct and encounter the archives as we craft historical and now in particular biographical narratives. In the great album, Kevin Young refers to a shadow tradition of African American literature, books that were once published but now lost to us, books that were never written, or books that have come to us as a mere shadow of what the author may have intended. These books, Young argues, form the basis of an alternative tradition, a ghost story, as he puts it, of an African American literature disallowed, vanished. In searching for fragments within the shadow tradition, Elizabeth Alexander, in The Black Interior, offers us a way to read interiority in what's present or presented, while Sadia Hartman asks us to imagine or engage in critical fabulation about what is missing. For Alexander, the living room comes to stand in as a metaphor for a space that is private but presentational. Are the living rooms of Black homes, Alexander asks, the spaces most consciously arranged and presented, representative not only of living spaces, but of oneself, one's aesthetic self? Following Alexander's cue, I ask, for instance, how might Cooper's archive serve as a living room of sorts, the semi-private space she designed and curated for public and future visitation? And following Hartman, I consider what is absent or missing, asking, for instance, What is the story that Cooper imagined but did not tell in that faded brown-covered booklet in which she announced authoritative beginnings but ended with the profane words of her grandfather's enslaver? Taken together, Young, Hartman, and Alexander suggest an approach to our encounters with the historical record and a way of reading that help me to attend to the silences and absences that obfuscate Black presence in the archives, while also foregrounding the importance of Black-authored archival documents. Part of Cooper's intellectual history exists in fragments, in scraps, traces, outlines, scrapbooks, the personal repository she built, the projects she proposed, the possibilities she imagined, and it is in this shadow archive just as much as in her published writings through which her story is told. It is here we find the places where her writings and aspirations challenged and exceeded conventional protocols, where she archived and preserved her own words and work, and where we learn about the writings lost or never produced, opportunities denied, and recognitions withheld. Approaching Cooper's archive in this way, we also learn something about what she might have seen as the most significant moments in her own life. Cooper, at 97 years of age, looked back to tell her family history, to attend to what had been left untold, to face the lost, the unrecovered, the unrecoverable, to become a documentarian of the histories of enslavement and their attendant erasures. So I entered this work wondering what it meant for Cooper, the historian. She was, after all, a trained historian, to attempt a history of her family, confronted by the silences of the archives and in the context of a lifetime devoted to addressing the falsehoods and erasures of dominant histories. Part of the work of this biography, then, is to tell the story of a family marred by legacies of slavery and of a woman who would become one of the most incisive critics of the complex ways this legacy will continue to permeate and define American experiences across intersecting identities of race, gender, class, sexuality, age, and ability. In this biography, I seek to tell the story of trailblazing Black feminist Anna Julia Cooper and to chart her development and contributions as an intellectual foremother of Black feminist thought and intersectionality. I seek to recognize her critiques, and particularly her critiques of gendered racial capitalism, as part of a longer, larger project of naming the legacies of slavery and traditions of resistance within and beyond the U.S. I seek also to attend to her family relations and how those relations and her understanding of them shape the person she would become and the work she would produce. Throughout this biography, I trace Cooper's trajectory from North Carolina, where she was born enslaved in 1858, we are presuming, and would come of age in Raleigh, situated as she was at the center of North Carolina's social and political life. Through scant but telling archives of letters and autobiographical self-fashionings, I offer a glimpse of Cooper as a child, precocious, determined, bold, irreverent, as she followed the path of many post-emancipation African Americans in grasping hold of the educational opportunities during the brief window of Reconstruction. I look at her time at St. Augustine's, the Normal and Collegiate Institute founded in 1867 under the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureau with the Episcopal Church, where through her mother's urging and support, her own academic prowess, and perhaps her family's place in the community, she would enter the first class of students. This is also where a young Annie would wage her first protest against the racial and gender disparities she would go on to confront throughout her life. Rejecting efforts to channel her into the girls' courses at St. Augustine's, for example, Cooper petitioned for admittance into the boys' courses and won. As she would later recount of her experiences at St. Augustine's, a boy had only to declare a floating intention to study theology, and he could get all the support, encouragement, and stimulus he needed, while a self-supporting girl had to struggle on by teaching in the summer and working after school hours to keep up with her board bills and actually to fight her way up against the positive discouragement to her higher education. And so it was that the advanced classes in classical education at St. Augustine's were reserved for the boys, until one day, Cooper tells us, one such girl flared out and told the principal that the only mission opening up before a girl in his school was to marry one of those candidates. So after securing her place through this early rebellion in the advanced classes and this principal, who she flares up against, will actually become one of her supporters and write this glowing letter of recommendation for her that kind of helps her move on to the next step in her journey. So after securing her place through this early rebellion in the advanced classes and completing an impressive classical education, Cooper would go on to teach at St. Augustine's, becoming an early architect of and activist for Black education in North Carolina. She would serve not just as a peer tutor, as is sometimes stated, but as one of the 4 staff helping to build, sustain, and grow St. Augustine's. She would also be the only woman, I'm so bad at keeping up with my slides. She would also be the only woman to sign the resolution of North Carolina Colored Teachers Association demanding appropriations for a state high school for Black students. In 1881, she would leave Raleigh for Oberlin College in Ohio. In doing so, she followed a well-worn path trod by an illustrious group of Black North Carolinian educators, abolitionists, and activists, including Ludsford Lane and James Harris from Raleigh, and from Fayetteville, Lewis Sheridan and John Copeland, who were part of the John Brown raid at Harper's Ferry, as well as Mary Jane Patterson, Henry Evans, and others. For this group of often mixed-race North Carolinians, born to free parents and sometimes with family lineages stretching back to Black service in the Revolutionary War, Oberlin represented freedom from the restrictive codes of the antebellum South and was one of only a handful of opportunities for co-educational interracial higher education. The pipeline built by Lane, Sheridan, Copeland, Evans, Harris, and Patterson meant that Cooper had a path to follow. It had been laid by other similarly situated Black North Carolinians, and in fact, I believe, but I'm not certain yet, that her address at 25 North Main Street is actually this house here, and was built by, was a storehouse that Henry Evans ran before they converted it into the dorm where Cooper would actually stay. So significant were the multi-directional flows between the budding Ohio town and the North Carolinian Black community that the land west of Raleigh City Center would take the name Oberlin, cementing the connection between the educational center in the Midwest and the aspiring Black community in the South. Graduating Oberlin in 1884 with a class that included fellow activist Ida Gibbs Hunt, Mary Church Terrell, and was preceded by Lucy Stanton, Mary Jane Patterson, and Fanning Jackson Coppin, Cooper's story would become intertwined with the larger story of Black women educators and activists who, at the end of the 19th century, moved unapologetically to the forefront of Black social and political reform movements. In her 1892 book, Cooper advanced an intellectual framework that would help usher in this movement, placing Black women at the center of the national discourse and calling on her fellow club women to start their own national organizations, famously announcing, "Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me." When Cooper and her contemporaries did launch their national organization 4 years later, the Washington Star referred to their founding convention as the most important gathering of colored women ever assembled on this continent. A voice from the South also established Cooper as one of the preeminent voices of the Black intelligentsia, culminating in her appointment as principal at the most prestigious secondary school for Black education in the country, Washington's M Street, later renamed Dunbar High School. Her prominence and visibility as a Black woman and an often outspoken advocate for racial and gender equality, however, also made her the target of the bitter local, regional, and national politics that congealed in the nation's capital as the country convulsed over questions about Black social, civic, and political rights. Her removal as principal, and picture is actually taken from, it's not one of the Scurlock pictures that are more common, but was taken by C.M. Bell, and this is Cooper when she is serving as principal at M Street, and you could see her steady, clear gaze at the camera, and of course her characteristic books on her lap. And then the two, well, let me finish and then I'll say more. That's what I get for talking out of turn. So her prominence and visibility as a Black woman and as an outspoken advocate for racial and gender equality, however, also made her a target of the bitter local, regional, and national politics that congealed in the nation's capital. Her removal as principal from M Street High School just 4 years after her appointment came, she would later explain, because of the courageous revolt she waged against Jim Crow curriculum in the nation's capital and for daring to prepare and send her students to elite white colleges and universities. And these are just two scraps that are in her archive. The one here is the 1904, that says 1904 on the top is a list of the students that she sent to different schools, white schools throughout the Northwest, but also black colleges and professional institutions. And then this is a note with her identifying her fighting against the lower color curriculum as her courageous revolt. So Cooper married briefly, but was widowed after only 2 years. And she supported and cared for at least 9. Previously, it's been 7, but I actually met some of her family members who didn't know her, but they were saying of their father that when his mother went to school at Columbia, that she left the kids with Cooper, and she took care of them for 2 years. So 2 additional kids. So she took care. She married, never had children, but took care of at least 9 children at various points throughout her life. Living to 105 years of age, Cooper would go on to work, teach, write, and publish for the remainder of her long life. At 66 years of age, she would defend her dissertation examining France's role in the transatlantic slave economy and how that undermined their own revolutionary ideals. At 93 years of age, she, after appealing unsuccessfully to W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP 20 years earlier, she would privately print a 2-volume study of the Grimke family and steward into print the journals and collected writings of her dear friend and fellow educator activist Charlotte Fortin Grimke. And finally, in 1956, at 97 years of age, she would start to write her own family history in what would remain the unfinished manuscript, Grapes from Thorns. Trying to see if I missed any. No, okay. So my approach in the biography is to understand Cooper in relation to the broad sweep of history of which she is a part. Her life bookended on one side by slavery and the Civil War, and on the other by the rise of Jim Crow segregation and the Civil Rights Movement. I recognize her as part of the dynamic cohort of Black public intellectuals and activists, and working within a tradition of Black political organizing and community activism. At the same time, however, I wanted to make sure I balanced attention to the broader historical context with a focus on family relations and their impact on the ways in which her life and intellectual thought took shape. Like her fellow North Carolinian, Cooper was aware of the ways in which larger social and political issues played out within her own family dynamics, and these issues became the themes that structured her literary and intellectual explorations. In this way, I sought to balance the grand sweep of history with the quiet, the personal, the intimate, which of course are often harder to grasp and glimpse than the public-facing, outwardly oriented proclamations and pronouncements. In this way, I proceed through a constellation of what Brent Hayes Edwards calls orchestrated fragments, recognizing that archival artifacts cannot deliver the past in a manner that would be seamless, much less exhaustive, and that historical narrative is unavoidably confounded by and embodied in silences. For instance, in another autobiographical fragment, Cooper roots her story not just in Black women's undisputed dignity, the phrase for which she would become so well known, but also in a tradition of shame and silence, as Mary Helen Washington pointed out. Cooper writes, "My mother was a slave and the finest woman I have ever known. Though untutored, she could read her Bible and write a little. Presumably my father was her master. If so, I owe him not a sou, and she was always too modest and shamefaced ever to mention him." This reframing helps us to understand that the voicelessness of Black women that Cooper names in A Voice from the South, They Could But Suffer and Be Silent, was not just about Black women not having a public voice. The great silence she refers to was also about her paternity and the sexual violation that precipitated it. It is about the inability to express outrage and how Black women had to endure this violation in silence. Not always, but it was also about the silence or lack of outrage on the part of the wider society in regards to this violence. Cooper's story and her incisive critiques will be propelled by her love and admiration for her mother and her outrage over this injustice. When she speaks on behalf of the women of the South, it is her mother and the scores of women like her whose case and cause Cooper is pleading. The trial metaphor, for instance, that opens A Voice from the South suggests that a great crime has been committed which has warranted no hearing at the bar. And it is this violation, its naming and redress, that become the raison d'etre for A Voice from the South, as well as Cooper's later writing and activism. Similarly, in precious few places do we learn about Cooper's relationship with her husband, George A.C. Cooper. The second Black man ordained in the Episcopal Church in North Carolina, it is Cooper who marks and memorializes his life with a simple but stately granite headstone in Raleigh City Cemetery and the stained glass window she commissioned in St. Augustine's Chapel. George, Cooper tells us, was born in the British West Indies in what is now Golden Grove, East Grand Bahamas in 1845. He and his brother Marshall helped build the first Anglican church in their hometown, while his mother was recognized for her, quote, good office in caring for the needy and in promoting the work of the church. I found at least one very unverified source stating that it was rumored, I mean, it was like double unverified as opposed to the opposite of double verified. So one unverified source that stated that it was rumored that George and Marshall's great-grandfather was Haitian president turned king, Henry Christophe. How George came to North Carolina is not known, but his impact, Cooper attests, was felt and recognized throughout the Black community in Raleigh, and Cooper attributed his early death to hard work and exposure suffered while serving his parish. George and Annie would count for half of the paid staff at St. Augustine's, but had George not died, Cooper would have continued on at St. Augustine's. Twice she planned to settle in Raleigh and live out her mission early imparted to educate the colored youth of North Carolina. But as fate would have it, George's untimely death, just 2 years into their marriage, unmoored Cooper from the settled life she had early imagined in Raleigh and put her on a pathway to become one of the foundational architects of Black education. Her relationship with George might also have been where her budding internationalism took root. In the last decade of the 19th century, Cooper traveled to the West Indies, perhaps to learn about the family, culture, and history of the man who she had imagined she would work alongside in dedicated service to the community, but whose life was cut short. During the 1890s, she also went to Toronto under the auspices of the Bethel Literary and Historical Society as part of a teacher exchange program. And in 1900, she was one of only 2 women, alongside her dear friend Anna Jones, to deliver an address at the first Pan-African Conference in London. She would then serve on the executive board for convening the second Pan-African Conference in Boston in 1902, a conference for reasons not known never happened. In 1925, she would defend and publish her dissertation on France's attitudes towards slavery, a capstone project that brought together her thinking about Black internationalism, perhaps a century in the making. Thus, it is in Cooper's archive that we find stories even more elusive than her own, but through which we come to understand her evolution in a web of historical events and family relations. We also see Cooper the historian, marking the lives of her family members in headstones and stained glass windows, in eulogies, and in the names she would give her adult school, the Hannah Stanley Opportunity School, the founding of which she said was the most important accomplishment of her life. In fact, she says, scrawled between 2 short lines on a survey, some will think the earning of my degree from the Sorbonne my most important accomplishment, but it was really the founding of the Hannah Stanley Opportunity School. It is in these moments, namings, and memorials that Cooper engages in a lifelong process of rewriting the country's dominant myths and mythologies and crafting her own past and family history. In the final part, I was so glad I'm on sync, okay. In the final part of my comments, I want to talk about another component of my approach, and that is thinking about the archives in relation to journeying to sites of memory, to evoke Toni Morrison's 1995 essay. In Sites of Memory, Morrison reflects on the autobiographical roots of fiction and the challenges of accessing an interiority that is not always represented in the written record. She describes her process as a kind of literary archaeology, on the basis of some information and a little bit of guesswork. You journey to a site to see what remains were left behind, and to reconstruct the world those remains imply. In visiting Raleigh, I got the sense of Cooper as someone whose roots were firmly planted in North Carolina. Indeed, the 2-mile radius stretching from the North Carolina state capitol, where Cooper's grandfather had aided in the planning and construction of the State House, running east on Oakwood Avenue to the wooded plot of land that would become St. Augustine's, and back west 4 blocks to Raleigh City Cemetery, where Cooper and her husband are laid to rest, mark an uneasy geography, a map, as it were, of the confluence of forces that converged to make her improbable journey possible. Born just 3 years before the start of the Civil War, Cooper's path was shaped by the unique social, cultural, and political conditions in North Carolina. As far as can be determined from existing records, Cooper was born enslaved to one of the most prominent slaveholding families in Raleigh, the Haywoods, and her mother, Hannah Stanley Haywood, and maternal grandfather, Jacob Stanley, were passed from John Haywood to his sons Fabius and George, respectively. As a commission-appointed state treasurer, a position that came with a permanent lifetime status, John Haywood, the patriarch of the Haywood family, was situated at the absolute center of North Carolina's social, economic, and political life. Indeed, for 40 years, John Haywood held the highest economic post in the state, serving as the state treasurer of North Carolina from his appointment in 1786 until his death in 1827. As state treasurer, John Haywood was influential in building the state capitol in Raleigh and in North Carolina state politics more broadly. The Haywood ancestral estate, Haywood Hall, stands just to the south of the Capitol building, and many of those enslaved by the Haywoods, including Cooper's grandfather Jacob, were hired out in the building and rebuilding after a destructive fire in 1831 of the state capitol. Like other so-called first families of Raleigh, the Haywoods were deeply invested in the slave economy and political life of North Carolina. Born in Edgecombe County to William and Charity Haywood, John grew up on the Dunbar Plantation just on the outskirts of Raleigh. His grandfather and namesake, John Haywood Sr., I'll call him, I don't know if he called himself that, John Haywood Sr. had been born in Christchurch Parish in St. Michael's, Barbados in 1685, and John Sr.'s father had migrated from London to Barbados in 1666. John Sr., however, followed an unusual path, not from Barbados to South Carolina, as was more typical for enslavers, but inland to North Carolina to serve as engineer and surveyor for the Earl of Granville. From there, the senior Haywood appears to have translated his knowledge of slave economy in Barbados, where the Haywoods owned 153 acres, to developing his own plantation in North Carolina, what would become known as Dunbar Plantation. The Dunbar forced labor camp is more accurate, would pass first from William Haywood, then to his grandson John, the soon-to-be treasurer of North Carolina. By 1847, the Haywood family owned 30 of the 172 one-acre plots in the city of Raleigh, and by 1860, according to Louise Hutchinson, the family had enslaved at least 271 people to work on their plantations in the surrounding counties and states and to maintain their city homes. While we do not have accounts from Cooper's mother or grandfather about life on the Haywood plantations or in the Haywood city homes, we do have 2 remarkable accounts from Lunsford Lane, who was purchased along with his parents by John Haywood. Lane's father was likely enslaved by John Haywood at the same time as Cooper's grandfather, Jacob Stanley, would have been. And Lane's story gives us some insight into the daily life that Cooper's grandfather and mother might have experienced. Lane himself may well have interacted with Cooper's mother as they worked in the Haywood City household, preparing the food, tending the children, cleaning the stables, readying the horses, managing the gardens, caring for the residences, and otherwise maintaining the daily lives of the Haywood family and their many guests and visitors. Though Lane, presumably like Cooper's mother and grandfather, was spared from a life consigned to the dire hardships of working in the field, his self-authored narrative of Lunsford Lane, as well as his 1864 biography, provide an extraordinary perspective on life as a town slave with the Haywoods, what he refers to as the daily anxiety that accompanied proximity to influential whites influential and ever fickle white town leaders. It was tradition, for instance, for John Haywood to host all the members of the state legislature for at least one meal at his home during the annual session of the General Assembly. These meals and other such events were recounted with nostalgia by one of Haywood's descendants, who described Haywood Hall as the scene of social and political gatherings where the slaves were kept busy caring for the house and its mistress and preparing sumptuous breakfasts. Eliza Haywood, who played host to such dinners for the duration of her husband's 40-year tenure as state treasurer, recalled the events less sanguinely, writing, "Mr. H. invited 30 gentlemen to dinner, and that has been the number every other day since. So you will see, I had 60 gentlemen to dine in 2 days only. I am almost wore out and broke down with fatigue and want of rest. We have company every day, 4 or 5, besides a large number every other day, so that I have no rest, night or day." Through Eliza's letters, we glimpse the extraordinary burden of meeting the household demands attendant to serving her prominent husband and his distinguished guests. We also see Eliza's failure to recognize or name the uncompensated labor of those she enslaved to perform the work she found so onerous. And while those who worked in Haywood Hall, like Cooper's grandfather Jacob and her mother Hannah, would have carried the burden of maintaining the household, they were also situated in relation to seats of political and economic and social power. Positioned as such, they might have taken opportunities to listen to conversations among state politicians and decision makers to see who was in the room and among whom they might find potential allies, however tenuous the support. They might also have consulted, advised, and assisted the Haywoods in their various business dealings and household administration, or they might have stolen glances at the family's elaborate library that was added to assiduously year after year. They might even have played with the Haywood children until they reached an age where their divergent roles as servant and master needed to be more overtly instilled. They might, too, have lived with the reality of being hired out to other households around Raleigh, as Cooper's mother was to Charles Busby in 1850, or lived with the fear of being sent to the field or sold off. While Lane notes that even for those fortunate enough to be town slaves, working in the Haywood mansions and subjected to less of the grueling hardships of those enslaved in the fields, the threat of being sold away, parted from kin and community, loomed as the most dreaded of fates for all enslaved persons. With their fates always in the balance, one thing was certain: those enslaved at the Haywood Hall bore the brunt of maintaining the lavish home and stately lifestyle that had become its trademark. In 1827, after 40 years serving as state treasurer, the longest serving state treasurer in North Carolina history, John Haywood died at the age of 73. Following Haywood's death, a committee of the legislature charged Haywood with malfeasance after discovering state accounts were missing almost $70,000, the equivalent of $2.1 million today. The Haywood estate was held responsible for reimbursing the state, and this case precipitated one of the largest sales of enslaved people in North Carolina history. This sale took place on the grounds of the state capitol, and the money from the sale of enslaved people was used to pay the Haywood debts and to thwart the seizure of lands from the rest of the Haywood family. Advertisements ran in the Raleigh Register, Newborn Sentinel, the North Carolina Star, the Western Carolinian, and other state and local newspapers from January 15th to February 19th, 1828. They announced the public sale to take place in the State House Square of 110 valuable slaves, a large portion of them young and likely boys and girls, noting that among them were several valuable carpenters, blacksmiths, and other mechanics, and several valuable house servants. One enslaved person, identified only as Virgil, stated that he would rather run to the free states than be separated from his family by the sale. Virgil did run, but was captured, returned to Raleigh, and sold, along with 125 after multiple iterations of the sale, people who had been enslaved by John Haywood, yielding $24,575 toward the payments of his debts. Despite this shameful episode, John Haywood remained popular among white residents of the city, and the Haywoods retained their status as one of Raleigh's most illustrious families. In journeying to the place, I saw the degree to which the history of the Haywood family is preserved throughout Raleigh on plaques, historical markers, street signs, and in Haywood Hall itself, which still stands today as a well-preserved and well-manicured emblem of the family's prominence and historical standing. Revisiting Cooper's archive, however, we know of the submerged history upon which the Haywood legacy and quite literally the city of Raleigh was built. To return to Grapes from Thorns, Cooper's booklet is one of the few places where Jacob Stanley is named and his labor recognized. He goes unnamed in the 1834 Assembly record on the list of laborers who worked on rebuilding the Capitol, but we know from Cooper that he was integral to the planning and construction of the state capitol. He is referred to only as House Jacob, as he has passed from one family member to another in the wills of John and Eliza Haywood. But Cooper's naming will write Jacob Stanley, his family, and his labor into this history. And indeed, just aside, the State Museum historians are actually using Cooper's account to include and situate Jacob Stanley within that history, even though he's not on the list and registers that they typically would rely on. And while Cooper's family may have been saved from a fate worse than death, as they were part of the cohort of household slaves passed between the Haywood family members rather than separated and sold out of state, the dispersal of enslaved people and families among the Haywoods precipitated an equally dreaded fate for Cooper's mother, as she was separated from her father and passed to George Haywood, the man Cooper's mother was always too shamefaced to mention, and about whom Cooper would later quip, "I owe him nothing beyond the initial act of procreation." Through these experiences and the stories Cooper tells about them, we get a sense of how her life as a public intellectual is born out of her own experiences, and how these experiences sharpen and shape her politics and the critiques she would develop in her intellectual thought, activist agenda, and educational theory and practice. For instance, Cooper names and evokes Jacob Stanley's bodily presence. He was an upstanding, broad-chested Black man. She recognizes African Americans as historical actors and legitimizes alternative sites of knowledge and memory. Family tradition has it that he took part in the planning and construction. She unveils and throws shade at the epistemologies of ignorance that pretend not to recognize the exploitative systems that are at the very root of their capitalist accumulation. If Jacob supports me, who the hell is going to support Jacob? And she recognizes how the apparent silences of the archive can shape and reshape the stories we tell. Perhaps then it is Jacob and Hannah's untold stories which ground Cooper's incisive and biting critiques of the racial capitalism and sexual exploitation that undergird not only the system of slavery, but also the unique brand of American democracy. In 1892, Cooper would conclude in her essay, One Phase of American Literature, that an enormous pecuniary debt is owed to the colored man for the 247 years of unpaid labor of his ancestors. We appreciate the incongruity and the indignity of having to stand forever hat in hand as beggars, to be shoved aside as intruders in a country whose resources have been opened up by the unrequited toil of our forefathers. But the principles of patience and forbearance, of meekness and charity have become so ingrained that there is hardly enough self-assertion left to ask as our right that part of the country's surplus wealth be loaned for the education of our children, even though we know that our present poverty is due to the fact that the toil of the last quarter century enriched these coffers, but left us heirs of the crippled, deformed, frostbitten, horny-handed, and empty-handed mothers and fathers. Oh, the shame of it. Starting with Jacob Stanley then, Cooper's archive will ask that we rewrite the sedimented narrative, "My father was my mother's master," and consider a different origin story, perhaps one that starts with the unrequited toil of her ancestors and that traces that debt to our current day. Thank you.
I love that. Really, that's
you.
great. I can't wait to read the book. And I love the riff on, well, Frederick Douglass and everybody else. My father was my master. My master was my father. My father was, how did you say?
My father was my mother's master.
Yeah, my father was my mother's master. That's brilliant. I use that as a title, for something. It is so good. So how's your progress coming? I don't want to act like the principal here. I know you have a contract for a series of it, and I want to know if we're going to cancel that contract or not.
The progress is coming fine.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because I feel like I've done so much research and so much work that the material is there, but it's having the time to really think about what is the shape that knits all of the story together. And I do think that this time here has given me the space to see, the ways in which the story is going to be knit together. And I did this. I've been kind of carrying this around with me because it's helpful. But Arnold Rampersad, the famous author of 5 tomes of biography, had said that people would come up to him and say, well, what kind of biography are you going to write? And he said he always hated that question, but then he realized that most of his life, he didn't really know what a biography was. And so he said, but if the biography is sufficiently open, the best form should emerge. So I've been kind of holding on to that and hoping that is actually going to be the case. But it's coming along well. It's coming along well.
It'll come in the writing. It'll come in the writing too. Mary Helen.
Okay. Thank you, Shirley. We've been following this now for months or maybe even a year, so it's wonderful to see how you brought it all together. I especially like that turn at the end, but that's not what I want to ask you about. Now that I, see the arc of her life coming together, the thing that I always go back to is, where does she get this voice? And it's a voice that you hear, like I went through the portable Cooper that, where you've collected so many of her stories, her poetry, her essays. And, there is this very powerful voice throughout. I mean, you certainly hear it here, whenever she's doing a kind of political analysis. But she has several voices. All of them, it seems to me, different, but they all have that kind of authority behind it. So I just wonder if you'd comment on how you have experienced that voice now that you've had a chance to, really get into the archives and to get into the biography.
Thank you for that question. It's interesting, actually. One thing I will say is there's an audio version of the book as well. And listening, Karen Murray is the reader for it, and listening to it at 1.3 or 1.4 speed, I am hearing it differently. Even listening to it, I hear it differently than when I encounter it when I'm reading it. But I think that part of the comments today are really about I didn't talk about this a whole lot, but trying to situate her early experience. I mean, I think her early experience is really central, and she'll talk about that through all of her work. These are my experiences, and how does that, and one of the words that comes up a lot is incongruity. Like, what are the incongruities between my experience and what I'm seeing in this dominant culture? What are the incongruities between my experience and what I'm encountering here? And so I think that's part of the space, but I also think, is really critical. She calls herself, she identifies herself as trained thinker and teacher, and she was a trained thinker. I mean, the education that she gets at St. Augustine's it's phenomenal. And so I think, she's encountering all of these different, she's taking political theory and civics and, and Greek and Latin. And so I think that she is really trained to think deeply about these. And I think those brought together with her own experience creates this powerful voice that we hear. And I also think too, though, that it is part of the kind of tradition and culture of the time. So, there's debates that are happening all of the time. There's convention movements. Like, there's a culture of, speaking back to and talking back to. And so I think she is very much part of that culture. But then again, her experience as a woman within that culture, again, the incongruities of her experience as a woman, I think motivates a lot of her critiques, and then she's trained in these different fields to kind of draw on them and to engage and subvert or to signify on them in certain ways that I think we can hear resonate throughout her work.
You know, to me, is one of the paradoxes of Cooper. She's a trained intellect. You know, she's fluent in Latin and Greek. You know, she comes through, in a way, kind of traditional educational backgrounds. But she writes in a kind of subversive, rebellious voice.
Yeah.
You know, can you account for that?
I mean, I think that that's exactly it. I mean, I think that it is drawing on, and I think that's why I talk so much about looking at her mother's experience and her grandfather's experience, and at 98, 97, 98 years old, she's looking back, and this is still this unresolved, like, how, in that question, like, Jacob Stanley was a slave, I do not know, how come? You know, and so I think that conflict and tension between her lived experiences and then her classical training. And I think, too, the classical training, and we have a classicist in the room, so I'm loath to say too much, but I would gladly open it up for feedback and conversation. But I mean, I think she's being trained in debate, in argumentation, in parody, in epic, and so I think she's taking this kind of formal training, but then refracting it through her experiences, and then again, still part of a very active, activist ethos in North Carolina. I mean, you have this whole cohort in North Carolina of activists, educators, intellectuals who are going to go to Oberlin, which is another, you know, activist. And she says the most important spaces for my development came at Oberlin in these weekly student kind of debate and discussion sessions. So I think, you know, it's also fostered through the different spaces in which she's at.
Yeah, that's good. What was the sexual incident? I mean, do you know what actually happened, or?
At M Street?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if there was one. I mean, I think that, and I think it's almost like it would have happened anyway. I think the incident was that she was teaching and preparing her students in a way that ran counter to what the DC, you know, government or DC politics wanted to allow at that time, and so they you know, trumped up charges about her having you know, inappropriate relations with John Love. So.
Oh.
Which.
Was she having a relationship with that?
I knew.
What was that more interesting? All that voice stuff. She probably was.
But you know, she's a grown woman, so.
No, but that's great. You got to write about it, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I was actually just sharing that, you know, it's really interesting to see. We don't have her letters to John Love, but we have John Love's letters to her. And they are just these adorations of Cooper, you know, and when she gets her degree, you know, I think they spoke to each other. He's so proud of her intellectual accomplishment and what this means, and that she was able to do it. And, you know, they're just these really gushing letters that he writes to her. We don't have her letters to him, and I think we find some of her, some parts of her in other places, but we don't get them in her letters. So.
And who was John Love?
So John Love was a member of the American Negro Academy. I haven't been able to find a whole lot on him yet, but he went to Hampton. John Love, and his sister Lula Love, who will actually marry Jesse Lawson, who is at Howard, and then they found the Freeling House together. But John and Lula Love actually are friends of Cooper's growing up in Raleigh, and then I think their mother passes, and so they end up going to live with Cooper, and they're boarders with Cooper at that time. But the way they played it in the M Street controversy was that, she was having these inappropriate relations with one of her foster children, but they were, I think, only about 10 years apart. And we've seen that before. He was teaching at M Street. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he was teaching at M Street. And so when that happens, they don't reappoint her, John Love, and I think 2 others.
Wow. She is, unless memory's playing tricks, in 1904, John Henry Adams did 2 essays on the new Negro man and the new Negro woman in the voice of the Negro. And one of the women is Lulu Love.
Oh,
and
okay.
with her photograph,
Ooh.
with her representation of her. I don't know if it's a photograph or a drawing because he used both.
Okay.
So check that out. Because I've always thought, Lulu Love, what a name. And that it must be made up or something, But that's interesting.
Yeah. And they Lulu Love and Cooper stay very, very close friends throughout her entire life.
Yeah.
Emily, and then me.
Okay. Thank you, Shirley, for a fantastic talk. And I wanted to start by saying, particularly because I'm sitting next to your mother, and it's a great honor to sit next to your mother, but to thank you very publicly for your transformative scholarship, but also the generosity with which you do it, the fact that you have made available so many archival materials for scholars working on Cooper, myself included, and for use in teaching. I mean, already what you've done is amazing, and I'm so excited about this project. I wanted to ask, coming off of this slide that's on the screen, you spoke about interiority and the challenges that poses to you as a biographer. I'm interested in how you're going to tackle questions of embodiment, because reading this, I think of a document which, again, I only know about because it's part of the archives that you've helped to make available, the transcript of the remarks that Cooper gave on the occasion of accepting her degree for the Sorbonne, the ceremony they hold for her in Washington, in 1925, where you use that striking phrase where you talk about what Cooper says between the lines, and she goes there and talks about, do you remember how broken she is by all the work, and she aligns herself with the mythological figure of Prometheus and the tortures that Prometheus endured, having his liver eaten out by an eagle. And she says, that's what it has felt like, but I would do it all over again for people to have an education. So I'd love to hear how you're thinking about the body and this genealogy of physical brokenness that you point to on that slide.
That is such a great question. And the two, really bringing those two things together, thinking about the interiority and the embodiment and how they, they really form and shape, I think, the perspective. Like, I think they're intertwined in really important ways. And I think it's everywhere in her work, thinking about what, how does my experience in this space register, and how is that part of the critiques and the challenges that I'm going to make? And, there's the famous passage in A Voice from the South where she's on the train and, she's faced with these two signs that, for coloreds and for women and, is it for whites and for, what is it? For whites and for color. And so she's saying, under which heading do I fall? Like, there is not a space within this current, racial hierarchy that even recognizes my embodied presence or my embodied experience. And so, I think her writing from that place becomes really important, right? Like, writing her body back into, and writing Black women's bodies and working class bodies, bodies that all kinds of bodies back into this space. Like, how are they experiencing these kinds of racial hierarchies in their day-to-day life? So I think that's really, really important. It's interesting. There's one document where she's talking about not getting the full promotion and raise from M Street, and she has, the kind of indignity of the kinds of things that they have them do, fill out this, say what classes you took, we know, right? These are our faculty activity reports. So, so she's doing this and enumerating everything. And then it says, but you didn't, this is after she has a PhD from the Sorbonne, you didn't score in a certain level on this test. And so she writes this, 4 or 5 page letter saying, here's what happened. Like, I took your test. I had to use the bathroom. There are no facilities that I could use. So I had to leave during the break, walk, 5 blocks, walk back. So my time in which to complete your test was, was curtailed by my own physical needs. And so, she's, in those moments, they seem like she's narrating an experience, but she's really writing that into, being. And I think those are the moments in the archive that, just spending time with them that have been so, so illuminating.
Hi. Thank you very much. Again, I say this every week, so illuminating and really good to hear you, Shirley. We've spoken, but just the depth and breadth of the scholarship is astounding. I'm curious about the whole Sorbonne, because I happen to know that quite a lot of West Africans ended up going to Sorbonne. The French, because they allowed the aristocrats would take their offspring from the Caribbean into higher education in France, and so I think it kind of opened the door for black scholars earlier than most places in Europe. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, because of the Pan-African Conference, if she may have met Africans while she was at the Sorbonne, which may have led to that. I don't know if you encountered any information on that. It's really for me, it's not for you.
No, that's a great question. She was certainly, Henry William Sylvester, she was certainly talking to other Trinidadian, African scholars and intellectuals in 1901. And that's a really good question, because those are the kinds of things I'm getting ready to think about as I keep moving forward, is like, how do we shift this context to see who's the circle of influence here? Who's the possible circle of influence that we don't typically recognize? And so that is a really great question. The direct way that she ended up there was it's a fascinating story, but she's often recognized as the 4th black woman in the US to get her PhD, but she actually announced intentions to do a doctorate, do her PhD in 1906. And then you couldn't complete one at Oberlin, so then in 1914 or 17, she actually, maybe it was 1914, she actually applies for her doctorate at Columbia. And this is after taking 3 summers of training, getting credentialed in higher courses in history, and I'm not sure which other ones, but history for sure. And so she applies at Columbia, and she completes this coursework, but she can't do the 1-year residency because she's taking care of 5 children. She has a job in Washington, D.C. that it has absolutely no interest at all in supporting this, this pathway for her. And so she can't do it. So she has to put it on hold. So she not that firsts matter, but just they matter in the sense of making apparent the structures that shift around what happens, right? So she would have been the first if she hadn't been blocked from doing it. But then she actually gets assistance from Felix Klein, who was a French scholar who had come to her class and when she was teaching in like 1901 or 2, had come to her class at M Street and was like, oh my goodness, this is so amazing, this beautiful colored woman teaching Latin, and so he was kind of, I'm being a little facetious, but he was, I think, smitten and really impressed with the intellectual and pedagogical work she was doing. So he, after she can't complete it at Columbia, she, years later, kind of revisits, like, I want to do this, and it's just a harrowing story of how it all comes together, but he facilitates her having her materials transferred to the Sorbonne, where she will have to write a new dissertation, not the project she did for Columbia, but another one, which she does in about a year's time, so under duress of being fired from her job at M Street. So.
Great presentation, Shirley.
you.
Excellent. My question about Anna was, so she was clearly super educated, she was beautiful, and she was very bold and outspoken and eloquent. I'm curious as to how much info you have on how she was received and perceived by other black men in the black liberation movement at the time. Because that combination of adjectives I just named, you know, that makes her like just have that wow factor. And I'm curious, was everybody just like, was she just like the Beyonce at that time in their eyes?
She was the intellectual Beyonce.
Yeah, she was the
19
intellectual Beyonce.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk about
That's a good question too. You know, it's hard to say. I mean, she definitely had some. You know, the thing that's great about her though is the ways in which she engaged people. I think is just, you know, it's playful, but it's also like, I will let you know, right? So like her and Du Bois had a long time exchange. A lot of people assume that they were, you know, they communicated from, you know, before they went to the Pan-African Conference in London in 1900, all the way through at least 1932. And they're, you know, they're writing back and forth regularly. But she's also, you know, I don't know, Cooper's 10 years older. She's 10 years older than Du Bois. And, you know, I think she just would always like kind of let him know, you know, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing at the crisis? You need to be thinking about this. Are you doing this? Are you thinking about that? And then one of my favorite letters I often share about is, you know, she had gone back and forth asking Du Bois about publishing opportunities in the crisis, and some things he did and some things he didn't. But in the 1930s, he misrepresents the Frelinghuysen University and says that the dean of Frelinghuysen is dead, you know, when he announces this. And she writes him this letter, and it's like, oh, Du Bois, you know, like, how could you make such a blunder? Like, don't you read your editorials at all? You know, so I don't know how, you know, I don't know how she really engaged, except that she was so feisty, you know, she was so feisty. So I don't know if people were like, you know, trying to holler at her, and she was, you know, I'm not sure, I don't know about all that. Catherine, do you know about that?
I don't know about that, but I love this question and this framing of Cooper, or I guess Beyonce would be the pop culture Cooper of this time. But I mean, I think that she was willing to confront this. Oh, sorry. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me into the conversation. I think she was or obviously she was definitely willing to confront like the major male figures at the time, and probably got pushback for that, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think it was something that was admired in terms of like the black male intellectuals. I think it was just like, you know, why you always gotta be calling us out kind of thing. And then she's like, well, why are you always doing stuff to make me have to call you out? But I do love what you're getting at with what we talked about a little bit last night with like Cooper and the erotic, and thinking about where and how that played a role in her life, because she's always presented in this very like uptight, buttoned up kind of way, and expanding how we're, you know, I love the work that you're doing with access to the archives, but also reinterpreting the archive and expanding the kind of story and narrative that gets told about her, that gets beyond this kind of lonely intellectual who's like toiling away outside of community, and you're bringing more attention to like the networks and the communities, but also other aspects of her life where we can, like, she's not just bunned up, but her hair is let down a bit. So I love that too.
Yeah, thank you.
So I am wondering about the influence and any intellectual acknowledgments by some of the people who did become involved in Pan-Africanism in this country. You mentioned Du Bois, but what also about like maybe Padmore, or also the people who were involved in the 1960s civil rights movement, who became Pan-Africanists like Stokely Carmichael. Have you found like any types of references in their speeches or any of their writings that kind of make a shout out to Anna Julia Cooper?
That's a good question. You know, I haven't kind of looked at that body of work with that lens, so I don't know if I can speak to that right at this time. But I do know that her work is so incredibly contemporary. When you read things like her dissertation on France's attitudes towards slavery and the dialectical relationship between the French and Haitian revolutions, that it really is so contemporary, and it's so, I want to say it's foundational to work that will come later, but a lot of those scholars don't actually cite her and don't recognize her work. So C.L.R. James doesn't cite Cooper. It's, the people who get recognized as the kind of major theorists, even of Black internationalism, but then the diaspora, oftentimes Cooper's not really in that conversation. So I think there's a lot to do and a lot to say about re-situating her in those conversations.
So I thought it was terrific, especially all of the digging that you did in Raleigh to contextualize her ancestors, and I thought it was really great because it's a sequel to what she's trying to write about. I'm really struck, though, by the periodization of her life, because it goes from the Civil War to civil rights. And so she's a teenager during Reconstruction, but she's still writing in 1956. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about that, how her life is a part of that huge sort of temporal arc, especially when it comes down to the pamphlet that she's writing in 1896. And this is at the height of Jim Crow. And what does it mean for her to be doing this kind of writing when there's so many prohibitions and there's so much violence against Black people? And I'm wondering if you, because I think there's a radical edge to her just saying and talking about slavery at a time when all of the promises of Reconstruction that she enjoyed, that she had at St. Augustine, are now shutting down. Yeah. So to me, that's the thing that's so revolutionary about doing this kind of biography, is that you're getting to see her in all of these major watershed moments.
Yeah, one of the things that's come up recently in my kind of reading and rereading that I was so struck by is just how much of a historian she is, and how much of a historian, like you're talking about these kinds of watershed moments. But I'm not, which pamphlet of 1896?
The Grapes.
Right.
Okay. The first effort to do her history.
1956.
Wait,
okay.
What's the 18? All right.
It's okay. But I was actually thinking about a 1902 essay she wrote, Ethics of the Negro Question, and she's looking back from this moment, this kind of post-Reconstruction moment, and she's so invested in how Reconstruction already, how Reconstruction's being rewritten. It's amazing, and like how much of her work is part of that project of this effort to stave off this rewriting of Reconstruction, this erasure of Reconstruction, this rewriting of enslavement. And so she really intervenes in that conversation, and she provides in 1902, she provides a very succinct, compared to Du Bois, I guess, but succinct kind of history of Reconstruction and of what undermined Reconstruction. And then, but I think what's interesting too is how her writings come together with so much of her other kind of work. So she's writing that, but then in 1925, she's gonna see too, Du Bois, you need to respond to Claude Bauer's racist history of Reconstruction. So she's really understanding, like, my writing's part of this project. I don't have the support or resources to write what the depth of this project that needs to be done, but let me tell Du Bois he should do it. But seeing that this rewriting of history is so important. And then the other thing is just how current and enduring her attention to like legacies of enslavement is, and how resonant it is with what conversations that are taking place right now, in this room, so many of us have been thinking about that and talking about that. And you could do a study where you read Ethics of the Negro Question or Voice from the South next to 1619 and be like, oh my goodness, she's anticipating, as others were. I mean, she wasn't alone in anticipating this, but it is stunning the degree to which, she's so attentive to it.
Three last questions. Two last questions.
Okay. Shirley, this is remarkable. I mean, I already had like a hard crush on Anna Julia Cooper, but now I've come up with a title, a fake title for your biography, and it is All the Things You Could Be by Now if Anna Julia Cooper was your mother's best friend. The layers, the layers. So my question is really about, it's a question. There's this moment in Robert Steptoe's series of essays about African American literature in the age of Obama, I think African American literary classics in the age of Obama. And he talks about a discourse of distrust that I think that Cooper's writing is in the center of. It might have something to do with her voice, but it definitely has something to do with the multiple genres of representation that she deployed. That there's something there that does not allow like Black writers, especially in the early 20th century, to occupy one location like, fiction or poetry.
Yeah.
But it's like fiction, poetry, film, like drama. I know she wrote plays as well, essays, criticism. Like she had to do all of the things because it was impossible not to. But I wondered, because I think that is actually at play for Du Bois, this distrust, that discourse. I wonder if you think it's at play with her work, because I, other than The Voice from the South, I haven't read a whole lot of her work.
Yeah.
But so I wondered what you thought about that. This is remarkable. Thank you.
Thank you. That's such a good question and a good title. Thank you. It is interesting to think about. I do think about her in relationship to Du Bois and recognizing, as many 19th century intellectuals and writers did, that they were working. They weren't just sociologists or, historians or, ethnographers or classicists. Because I think those, the boundaries of those disciplines, fields, genres were always so racialized and gendered that to stay within one, I think would not have been sufficiently broad enough, to make the kinds of critiques. And it is fascinating to see them moving around within the genre, like even within that space, the constant ways in which, humor, sarcasm, irony, punning, that there's this constant interplay and tension even within, but then bringing them together. Like, how do I work across different genres to try to find a way to articulate this thing that is so difficult to articulate? It reminds me and anticipates maybe a little bit of, thinking about Zora Neale Hurston, and working across so many different genres to experiment with like what can give voice to the kinds of representations that I want to create that I don't see in all of these other places that are so circumscribed. I feel like we're getting close to the end. Okay, one last question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this. My name is Mansoor, and my question is about that phrase, my father was my mother's master. And it's kind of resonating with me because my great-great-grandmother could have said the same thing, or in terms of like landowner sharecropper situation. And in my family, it's something that's contested. Like my grandmother has recently like found our white cousins, and kind of like the family's kind of like we don't need to have anything to do with them. And so so I'm wondering in her life, and I know she never like finished her own family sort of history that she was starting, but do you think she would have included her white family in her life? Did she just kind of dismiss that part of her?
That's a powerful question. It comes up in places. It comes up in these spaces and moments where it's inserted in, things like that, like my father was my mother's master. But she'll say things too, like, I'm a genuine first family of America. She's like, my father, she'll say the part of my family that didn't come over on the Mayflower was brought here the year before in that fateful ship in 1619. And then she'll say, neither of us are actually heirs to this land. And so she doesn't exactly say that. Let me not put words in her mouth. But I think that it's moments like those where she's recognizing these complex lineages. Lineages, thank you. It's been, no, I meant lineology. Lineage, so yes. So, well, do you want to give context for?
I think in there she says that she's against the interracialism of the New Negro movement. So that was the one place where I read that she had, definite feelings about that.
Yeah. She is. There is a kind of. I don't think even when she's recognizing those moments of her lineage, I don't think there's a kind of, this embracing of it. I think it's always in a really, really conflicted way. And then she does have, there are lots of places where she talks about, I'm not aspiring, and we are not aspiring to this kind of social equality bought through interracial relations. So I think that was, I think that the idea even behind that was contentious to her.
Thank you so much. This was